Now you're listening to Fantastic Formosa with John Abrams in Taipei. Hi, this is John Abrams, Fantastic Formosa. We have another episode today. We invited Ross Feingold back, the lawyer. He's been in Asia for a very long time, knows the law. But tonight we wanted to talk a little bit about the craziness going on in America with the upcoming elections and Texas border problems. And Texas looks like it might, we don't know what's going to happen with Texas. But first of all, the elections in America, they've changed quite a bit over the past 50 years. What's the biggest change that's affected them?
Oh, thanks, John, for having me back. When I talk about U.S. politics to audiences here in Taiwan or elsewhere, I do try to explain the partisanship that's developed in the United States, or hyper-partisanship, as some people call it. And it's not everyone, but there are a lot of people on both sides of the political divide who are very strong in their beliefs, to the point, I would say, of anger. And they deliver that anger when they're talking about these issues.
Oh, my gosh.
So it becomes very hard just for the average person to have any discussion with someone from the other side. And we see that in United States Congress or in state governments as well. Unfortunately, there's no spirit of bipartisanship, which makes it very difficult to get things done. Although there is currently a bipartisan immigration bill that leaders are negotiating, but it's very, again, it's going to, although the negotiation is bipartisan, it's going to turn into a partisan issue because there's a significant number of Republicans who object, and former President Trump has said he opposes making a deal. He'd rather that the current problems at the border continue for the rest of this year until he's elected president and he could fix the problems at the border. And of course, when I'm asked about this issue as well, I also emphasize that there are lots of relevance to Taiwan as well.
Well, yeah, Taiwan is a big issue in the upcoming election as well. But getting back to the Texas border issue real quick, do you think the Texas governor has created a political, political scene on purpose to unify the Republican Party base, maybe? Or
it's a good question. So if we take a step back and talk about what's transpired at the border, usually we think of border control as being within the purview of the federal government, not state government. And that's generally been the case over the past few hundred years in the United States, that the regulatory authority, the policing authority for border security is the job of the federal government, not the state government. That's why there's a federal government agency called the Border Patrol, for example. Right. If you need a visa, it's the federal government that issues a visa to enter the United States. When you come into the United States through the airport, it's federal immigration officers who look at your passport and let you into the country, or prohibit you from entering in some cases. Right. But we don't think of it as a state issue. However, to be fair to the good people of Texas, the number of people crossing the border, both legally and illegally, has jumped. It's quite a lot of people, no matter whether you measure it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and it causes a lot of problems for border communities, people coming across private property. That's something that a lot of people don't realize, John, is that there actually is a large amount of privately owned property from Texas all the way to California, so along the southern border, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas. There's a lot of privately owned land, farmers or ranchers, and they own the land that abuts the border, but typically they do give the federal government access for patrolling purposes to their land. But again, it's usually the federal government, but the state government and the people who live near the border in border towns, as we like to call it in American English. They feel a bit overrun by the large number of people coming in. These people often have nowhere to go, or what typically happens is they'll present themselves to the Border Patrol and say, I want to apply for asylum. And the Border Patrol will give them will take down their particulars and then give them a number and a date, a file number and a date to see a judge, which could be years into the future. And then they tell these people that you're on your own. They're not going to detain these people in the interim. So they just say, you're free to go. So once people cross the border, they get processed if they wish to be processed, if they wish to make an asylum claim, and off they go. And sometimes they're staying near the border, and it puts a lot of pressure on nonprofits, or people don't like to see people who live there don't want to see lots of migrants sleeping in the streets, for example.
Makes them nervous, obviously.
Well, yeah, if you're not used to having homeless people living in the streets of your town, then yeah, it could be uncomfortable or even shocking. And we're talking about thousands of people coming across on a bad day. Instead, I wouldn't call it a good day. I'd call it a bad day. Thousands of people are coming across. And they're coming from not just South America or Central America. So they might be coming from Venezuela, El Salvador, Guatemala.
Even China.
But yes, they're coming from other parts of the world as well. Africa, China, India are countries that have been named as the sources of some of the illegal entrants. Also keep in mind another complex aspect to this discussion is if somebody enters illegally or at the ports of entry, the legal way, they just say to the Border Patrol officer, I'd like to claim asylum. I'm terrified of going back to my country. I have a legitimate claim. I'm afraid of persecution, for example, due to my religious beliefs or sexual orientation, for example. And that makes them they're not illegal at that point, right? They've presented themselves to the Border Patrol. They've asked to claim asylum. And as I said earlier, they get a court date, which might be years into the future. So a lot of people don't appreciate that, right? They don't appreciate that a lot of the people coming in who are putting stress on the system are coming through legal crossings. They're lining up at the border crossings. They enter the United States and they say, I'd like to claim asylum. That doesn't make them an illegal immigrant at that point. So there's both. There are people who entered legally and there are people who entered illegally. A lot of the people who entered legally are making asylum claims, and they're not going to see a judge for years into the future. So they're turned away. I mean, they're not turned away. I mean, they're turned out, right? They could live in the United States. They could get paperwork to work. Then there are the people who sneak across who are not making an asylum claim, and they really are the people who are living in the shadows. They are working illegally. And it just adds to the number of people who might be in the country illegally, or the number of people who have entered legally but are trying to make asylum claims. So all these factors add up to a lot of people coming across the border every day, a lot of stretched communities. And Texas state government, the governor is a conservative Republican. He's basically said, I've had enough of this. So he's called up some of the state National Guard troops, and he's had them put concertina wires, like barbed wire, in those rolls of wire along the border. And he's put them along the border in the busy crossing points, and he's trying to take action within his authority to discourage people from coming into coming into Texas from Mexico.
But that area is a very small area of Texas, right?
Well, the border is hundreds of miles long, and he's only, if he was going to put concertina wire across the entirety of the border between Texas and Mexico, it would take a long time. It would be a lot of manpower, hours, under harsh conditions, because in the summer it's very, very hot, and in the winter it's not so comfortable either.
This is a political stunt in such a small area?
Ideally, the state government and the federal government would work together. So the governor's view is the federal government is not doing enough to stop the number of people who are coming across And because of the federal government failing to do its duty, me as the governor, I'm going to step in and do what I think I need to do to secure the borders of his state. So yeah, politically it's very popular. I mean, he's been reelected. He's elected and reelected because the majority of voters in Texas like his policies, and he's a very conservative governor, as I said. So it doesn't matter what the issue is, abortion or gun rights, border control. He has very conservative viewpoints, and it goes down very well with Texas, the majority of Texans, because they are a majority conservative state. But as we were talking about earlier in the program, John, the issue is, does he have a right to try to secure the border with state resources? And the view of the federal government and the view of the courts, because the Supreme Court refused to take the state's case after an appellate court ruled in favor of the federal government, is that, no, you cannot do this, Governor. You do not have a right to put concertina wire along sections of the border. Only the federal government could do that. But by putting this concertina wire along the border between Texas and Mexico, you're actually making it difficult. This is the federal government's argument. You're making it difficult for the federal government's Border Patrol officers to do their job, because now they can't actually get to what's literally the border, because the wire is not actually on the border. It might be a few feet inland on the Texas side of the border, a few yards, or it's not literally on the border in some cases. But it's blocking access to the border for the Border Patrol, the federal government Border Patrol. And the federal government said this is illegal. And the courts up to now have ruled with the federal government, because immigration is basically or inherently the responsibility of the federal government. So to give an example, one of the arguments of the federal government once they went to court was to say this wire, this concertina wire, which is like barbed wire, that the state government has put on sections of the border, it blocks the federal government's Border Patrol officers from getting to the border. And part of that border is a river, and there are people who might be drowning in the river, or there are people who almost drowned and they made it to shore, but they need medical attention. And the state government is blocking that. And it's the job of the federal government to police the border, and that includes providing medical care to people who are in distress. So the courts have been sympathetic to the federal government, and the federal government is trying to get in there and take away this concertina wire. Then we're going to get into arguments about who's going to pay for the wire after the federal government moves it away. But then there's another interesting aspect to this, which is, as I said, the State National Guard has been called up to assist, and there are people calling for the federal government to federalize the State National Guard, which is
right. They can do that during wartime.
They can do that. So there's a right for the federal government to federalize State National Guard units. I would say it's a fairly broad right. You just have to declare there's some sort of emergency that necessitates federalizing the State National Guard. And there are precedents for do that, not in wartime, such as during the Civil Rights era.
Right.
There are progressives, Democrats, who are calling on President Biden to take the State National Guard away from the state government
that won't be
federalize it.
Well, I mean, every state, this might be very unique to the readers or listeners of this program, is that in America we have 50 states. Now, they each have their own little militia or National Guard unit. That might seem very strange to a lot of people.
Well, we should also add that it's different. The State National Guard units are distinct. They're different from what is called the reserves, the Army Reserve,
right.
or the reserves of the other
the
other branches of the military. So State National Guard is under the control of the governor. The Army Reserves are not. Or the Air Force Reserve, Navy Reserves.
Mm-hmm.
So the reserve system is under the federal government.
Right,
the State
exactly.
National Guard is under the state governor, unless it gets federalized by the President of the United States. So the State National Guard units are often called out when there's a natural disaster.
Right, exactly.
And the governor needs...
They're right there, ready to go.
The governor needs additional resources to help rescue people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the State National Guard units are mobilized during times of unrest, if there's riots, And they have been called out when there's security-related issues, such as after 9/11, or even to secure
Airports.
events like
9/11.
like a Boston Marathon, for example.
Oh,
New York
yes.
City Marathon. A governor might feel that it's necessary to call up additional State Guard national units, because a lot of the State Guard national units, they're trained in some of the specialized skills that the Army is trained in, whether that's providing security, engineering, crowd control, a variety of skills that you might want uniformed, trained personnel to attend to. So theoretically, it makes sense to mobilize the State National Guard to patrol the border or provide additional resources to the state and local police forces. And Texas they have the Texas Rangers, which is a state police force.
Very famous.
The local communities have their own police,
right?
Or counties have sheriffs. So the governor, I'm not doubting the logic of his view, is he wanted to provide additional resources because of the public safety issues and other issues that are raised by the very large numbers of people who are crossing the border into Texas every day. But again, there's this core issue that unfortunately makes the governor's plan fail, which is you can't have the State National Guard patrolling the border or putting up barriers that prevent the federal units, the Federal Border Patrol, for example, from accessing the border. This really is simply a constitutional question. And that's why ultimately the Supreme Court refused to take the case. Even a very conservative Supreme Court that typically rules against the Biden administration.
That's true.
It rules for conservatives and conservative governors like Governor Abbott of Texas. They refuse to take the case because they know, as conservative as they are, that the border is within the authority of the federal government.
Well, the Texas state is, as I understand it, has a very unique state constitution, right? As I understand it, that they joined the union under certain conditions. They originally were a separate country, and then they took on statehood only because they were being threatened by Mexico.
That all may be true, but they don't get special treatment just because of the way they wrote the state constitution or their brief history of being part of Mexico and then being an independent country. There is a doctrine called preemption, which is, at the end of the day, the federal government's authorities do preempt the state governments. And the Supreme Court, again, they were reluctant to overturn that for issues such as who gets to police the border. Then there's another aspect to the governor's actions, which the federal government probably cannot intervene. And what Texas and also Florida have done at times is they've gathered up some of these migrants. They've given them a seat on a bus or even a seat on a plane, and told the bus or the plane to go to a state controlled by a Democratic governor.
New York
or Illinois.
Chicago, yes.
And just let the people off the bus or the airplane there.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, they don't even know where those
sort
people
of a dirty
going.
trick politically.
Well, politically, yeah, I'd call it that. And I'd question the humanity of doing that. A lot of the migrants, they probably would make their way north anyway. Very often, that's their goal. They want to go to a big city like New York City or Chicago, on the assumption that there might be more job opportunities, whether legal or illegal, than might exist in Texas. I mean, Texas does have two relatively big cities, but in the scheme of things, Dallas and Houston are relatively small. And they might have relatives further north as well.
Of course.
But Texas doesn't ask that. When they tell a migrant, get on the bus or get on the airplane, they don't ask, sir, do you have a relative in New York that you're going to join? They just round up the people and say, here, get on a bus or get on an airplane. And that's been very frustrating for mayors and governors in the destinations further north where these buses or aircraft travel to and let out the migrants that have been, I wouldn't say forcibly, but with quite an amount of persuasion by the Texas or the Florida government, have been put on these buses and planes. Again, I would question the humanity
I agree.
of doing that.
Of course. Chicago apparently is having some serious problems, not only in the city but in the suburbs, where they're not used to this sort of crisis. But something I read that the Chicago mayor was having what we call panic attacks and going to the hospital. That's quite shocking. It must be a serious crisis if he cannot handle the emotional overload of responsibility as a leader.
Well, I hope the governor gets well. I'm sorry, the mayor gets well soon. Being the mayor of Chicago is a heavy burden without hundreds or thousands of additional migrants coming into the city, and either they're going to be living on the streets in many cases,
it's too cold
or
up
local
there.
municipal governments or state governments are going to have to step in and provide additional housing. But typically, most cities in America, they don't have enough shelters, as we call them in America, to house the indigenous homeless population. And then suddenly hundreds or thousands of migrants show up, and they also need a place to stay.
And some of them with children.
Some of them, exactly. And it is wintertime, as you pointed out, in the northern United States, so it's very cold. People can't really stay out all night. It's cold. It snows.
What about these sanctuary cities? Isn't Texas just saying, look, if you're declaring yourself a sanctuary city, then put your money where your mouth is, basically.
Well, I think there's some misunderstanding with what these politicians meant when they called their city or their state a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state. What they meant was, and it really was a simple legal analysis, what they meant was when they carry out law enforcement duties, such as stopping a car for running a red light, they're not going to ask the driver about their immigration status and hand that information over to the federal government. That's really what they meant by sanctuary cities. They certainly did not mean that we have unlimited resources for migrants, legal or illegal, and we're willing, out of the kindness of our hearts, we're willing to give payments to people who just came across the border, or we're willing to help them find jobs. We're going to give them places to live, et cetera, et cetera. They really did not mean that. What they meant was they're not going to help the federal government enforce the federal immigration law because they felt that was a bit inhumane. And sometimes it does lead to peculiar outcomes. If there's people who've been working in the underground economy for a number of years, they might even already be married. They might have children that were born in the U.S. And those children are United States citizens.
Very normal.
And then if you stop them for a red light and you ask about their immigration status and they're illegal, and you hand them over to the nearest office of the Border Patrol or Immigration and Customs, they're going to get expelled. Right. And some mayors and governors, they took the view that would also be inhumane. And anyway, at its core, they felt that it's just not the job of a local or a state government to enforce the federal immigration law. So if we stop somebody for running a red light or for a misdemeanor crime like drinking in public, for example,
of course,
it really is not our job to ask them about their immigration status. We'll prosecute them for the crime that we've stopped them for, or we'll write them a ticket for running the red light. But we're not going to hand them over to the federal government for expulsion. So a number of Democratic-led states and cities have taken that view, and that's what they mean by sanctuary city. But again, they certainly didn't mean that we'll take in and care for every migrant who asks for that kind of assistance. They absolutely did not mean that. But in the political arena, in the hyper-partisanship that exists in the United States, unfortunately, that's what some conservative or Republican state or municipal leaders have turned the phrase sanctuary city into. But that's really not an accurate portrayal of what sanctuary city means.
But both parties seem to twist the definitions of different things, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats as well. We see all kinds of strange language. As you were saying earlier, it's so divisive. Back when I was a young man, we had Republicans and Democrats. We could just have a good time. We could go to the basketball game, or we weren't trying to kill each other over a simple conversation about But people today in America are actually ending lifelong friendships over simple arguments about the Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, unfortunately, the U.S. at the moment is not like Taiwan, where the legislature is famous for physical altercations.
In the early days.
Well, even recently, in recent years, it still happens sometimes, or shouting matches,
Right.
Or throwing food at each other.
Right.
But the common joke that's told is, even when that happens, everybody knows that the legislators from different parties, they go to karaoke at night together.
Of course.
But that's not the situation right now in the United States.
No.
And you look at maps that are color coded to show where which candidate in 2020, Trump or Biden, got the majority of votes in that location. What we typically see is the big cities on the coasts, like New York City, Boston, Miami,
Seattle,
and in California, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and in inland big cities like Chicago or Detroit, overwhelmingly voted for Biden. But then the vast expanse of America outside the big cities. So if we look at if we color code the counties across America,
right.
You would see that they were all red being the color of the Republicans. And so you would see that this, like I said, this vast expanse of the United States from coast to coast, from north to south, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, from the East Coast to the West Coast, outside of the big cities, the majority of votes went to Trump. So it does indicate one thing, that outside of the big cities, Americans do tend to be more conservative. And it also indicates hyperpartisanship, because you're not going to find a county in Colorado or Nebraska outside of big cities
Denver, of course,
that voted for Biden. You're just going to find every county, majority of vote, went to Donald Trump and the Republicans. And there's also a way to look at that map is, you could literally, people say, you could literally walk from Maine to the, on the East Coast to parts of Washington State or even Oregon on the West Coast, and you'll never pass through a county that voted for Biden and the Democrats. So you could literally walk across the United States. You just walk through rural areas, and the conservative vote would be contiguous outside of the big cities. So again, this leads to the hyperpartisanship that we currently
it's
have
quite
in the
shocking.
United States.
Yeah. We used to call, or actually we still call that the flyover country. That's what the Democrats often refer to. And then the bicoastal elites is the reference to the big cities on the west and east coast.
Yeah, but that's true. I mean, there are, even in flyover country, there are Democrats.
Of course.
But they are a minority. Just like in the big cities, they're going to be Republicans. Look, Trump came from New York City, right? But the majority in the big cities, like the cities that I mentioned, large majorities vote for Democrats. And that's why in 2020 election, Joe Biden likes to say that I won by 6 or 7 million votes. But yeah, that's because in New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco and a few other big cities across America, you won by lopsided number of votes in those big cities. But my gosh, when you go into the rural parts of America, outside of the big cities, I like to tell people, be very careful what you say when you talk about politics, because it's highly likely that if you're in rural parts of America outside the big cities, that the people around you, for example, if you're eating in a restaurant, it's very likely that the people around you voted for Trump and the Republicans. So just be very careful what you say. The safest thing to say is you love Trump if you're in a rural part of America, and if you're in Los Angeles or New York City, the safest thing is to say that you love Biden.
Yeah, the irony, though, of Trump being so popular in the conservative rural areas is that he is by no means a rural, he's a big city developer. He's a multi-millionaire. He has nothing in common with the working class of the farming communities.
But to his credit, he's captured in now his third time running for election. He's captured a lot of what people in flyover country, as you called it, he's captured a lot of what the voters want. certainly on gun rights or ending abortion rights. And Trump nominated to the Supreme Court 3 justices who helped ensure that a constitutional right to an abortion was overturned. So a number of these cultural type of issues, Trump has accurately captured what the voter in flyover country wants. Even the trade protectionism as well, and increasing tariffs on goods, most notably from China, but from other places as well, and protecting the blue-collar worker. And Biden's been trying to change that. To be fair to President Biden, a lot of his initiatives and a lot of the legislation that he was able to pass in his first 2 years in office, because he had a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives and a Democrat-controlled Senate, a lot of the legislation that was passed was meant to help blue-collar workers, unionized workers as well, such as the infrastructure legislation that was had bipartisan support, not overwhelming bipartisan support, but some Republicans did vote for it. But that creates a lot of good-paying blue-collar type of jobs to reconstruct America's highways and bridges and airports and ports. And Biden will be running on that. He'll be saying, I get why some blue-collar voters didn't vote for me in 2020, but here's what I've delivered for blue-collar voters. It's pocketbook kind of issues, so I hope you support me this time. And he'll be making that argument over the course of this year. And we saw an example of that because the Auto Workers Union recently endorsed President Biden for re-election. And President Trump was extremely angry about that. He's been sending some very angry social media posts about the president of the United Auto Workers Union. But like you just said, John, the message from President Biden or from the Auto Workers Union was that he's a billionaire. And he doesn't really understand the problems of the working class, blue-collar, unionized manufacturing worker. So again, we'll see that battle play out over the course of this year, where Biden will say, I delivered a number of things for blue-collar workers. And Trump is going to say, well, I'm the tariff guy, and I'm protecting the jobs of blue-collar workers.
Real Americans.
There you go. Well, we're all real Americans, even if we don't look alike or we have different family heritages. In America, we don't have different classes of citizenship. We have one type of citizen. Okay. Unlike here in Taiwan, where they actually do have different classes of citizenship. Well, but getting back to the immigration issue, there's a bipartisan proposal making its way through Congress at the moment as we speak. It may get approved. It may become law. And this would give more money to border enforcement. But it would also limit the number of people who could come into the United States every day. And once the system, the capacity of the Border Patrol to process people, shelters for people to stay in, it will put a cap on the number of people who could come in every day. So then the question becomes, well, what happens if the cap is 5,000, you're number 5,001 to try and cross the border? The United States will say, come back tomorrow, stay in Mexico. Now, there was previously initiative by the Trump administration called Stay in Mexico, which was a deal that the Trump administration...
Is that permanent?
Well, it was a deal that the Trump administration made with Mexico, where people trying to claim asylum for fear of persecution or violence in their home country, where they would have to apply for asylum from Mexico. And there was a lot of litigation about this. People in the U.S. sued the federal government. NGOs in Mexico sued the Mexican government. And they basically said that the way asylum is supposed to work is where you show up and ask for asylum, they're supposed to take you in and hear your claim. But the Trump administration was saying we're overwhelmed with people claiming asylum. We made this deal with Mexico, where Mexico said, okay, if someone's claiming asylum in the U.S., they could wait in Mexico while their claim in the United States is being processed. But again, people in the U.S. said this is not the way asylum law is supposed to work. And in Mexico, NGOs sued the Mexican government. The courts in Mexico ruled against stay in Mexico. They said this program is unconstitutional in Mexico as well. So that was the end of stay in Mexico. Then there was another program called Title 42, because that was the section of the U.S. law where this was. And this was during the pandemic, or the worst of the pandemic, because actually people are still getting sick with COVID-19 as we speak. But there was something called Title 42, which was a section of U.S. law which gave the federal government authority in a health emergency, like a pandemic, to refuse entry. So even if somebody was coming across the border and presenting themselves to a border patrol officer and saying, I've arrived and I want to claim asylum, Title 42 allowed the federal government to say, nope, sorry. Or if the Border Patrol caught people who came over illegally, they can immediately put them back on the Mexican side of the border and say there's a health emergency. Due to the health emergency, the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot take in any more people at the moment. So we're pushing you back onto the other side of the border. We don't care what your claim is, asylum or anything else. You're going back to the other side of the border. Buy a plane ticket, get a visa, come back into the United States legally. But you're coming in this way illegally, or you're asking for asylum. Sorry, due to the health emergency, we're turning you back. That program had to terminate as well because the United States terminated the health emergency. So unless we're declaring the federal government is declaring that there's a health emergency, then you can't use this Title 42 authority to turn away migrants. So because the health emergency ended, and I think that's what most people wanted, they wanted the federal government to end the health emergency and the different things that get activated during a health emergency, different authority for the federal government gets activated during a health emergency. Because of the end of the health emergency, that ended this Title 42 authority under which the federal government was able to turn away migrants. What did all this mean? It did mean that we had this surge in people coming across. There was no more remain in Mexico. There's no more Title 42. And again, that brings us to where Congress is negotiating with the Biden administration as we speak, John. And they're negotiating in a bipartisan way because there are Republicans and Democrats who are part of the group who are trying to negotiate a law to limit the number of people that could come into the United States every day and give more money, a lot more money for Border Patrol. They're having a bipartisan negotiation as we speak, and they might finish it soon, and then they'll come out of their secret room where they're negotiating this bill, and they'll tell the rest of the members of the Congress on the House and the Senate side, here's the bill, take it or leave it. And there are a lot of people in Congress who are going to be very, very unhappy about this because they don't like big pieces of law, important stuff with enormous complexity that's going to cost a lot of money to be negotiated by a small group behind closed doors who come out of the room and say, we've made a deal, now you have to vote for it. And they don't give the members of Congress a lot of time
to read it.
And so people ultimately, they're forced to vote yes or no on something that is crucial for the United States security, but that people haven't had a chance to, that the members of Congress haven't had a chance to read. So there are going to be a lot of grouchy Republicans, especially the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats, they'll go along with this. If it's negotiated with the participation of the White House, most Democrats are going to say, well, if Biden supports this, I'll support this. But among the Republicans, there are going to be a lot of grouchy Republicans who are going to say, you're trying to jam this bill through without giving us a chance to read it. And you're saying take it or leave it because you're saying we also can't make any amendments to the text. You're just trying to rush it through. And they're also the more conservative members of Congress. What's ever in this bipartisan deal that's under negotiation is not going to be enough for them. It's not going to be enough money for more immigration judges, for example, for more Border Patrol officers. It's not going to restrict the number of people sufficiently who can come in legally every day. And then the other thing is, to make this even more complex, and fortunately the show is almost over, John, otherwise we'd be talking about it forever, the border enforcement bipartisan deal that's under negotiation, apparently it's going to be thrown together in one big bill that's going to have the border security issues, additional aid for Ukraine, additional aid for Israel, and additional money for the military to spend in the Indo-Pacific region, including with regards to Taiwan. So although we've been talking about immigration law for the last 40 plus minutes, actually this is crucial for Taiwan because the plan among the White House and the congressional leaders was to make a big bargain to put in the same piece of legislation these very unrelated issues, money for military aid for Ukraine, money for military aid for Israel, money for military aid for Taiwan, and border security all in one bill, and to tell the members of Congress, take it or leave it, you got to vote yes, up or down on all these different things. And there are Republicans who are going to feel that the border security is insufficient. What's in the new bill will be insufficient. They're against additional aid for Ukraine. They do support additional aid for Israel and Taiwan. But a lot of Republicans are going to be very frustrated about all these things being thrown together in one bill. But if the bill gets passed, John, I'm happy to come back and talk about it.
Well, this is fascinating stuff because the election year is coming up. This is another episode. We're signing off. I'm John Abrams. Welcome, Ross Feingold, to Fantastic Formosa. Hope you can come back.